Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. It's monthly wrap-up time, and September's been a pretty good month for me, actually. I've read some really good vintage science fiction and classics. I've enjoyed what I'm reading. But I would say that the highlight of the month for me was meeting Alastair Reynolds again, who came up to Birmingham for an event for the Birmingham Science Fiction Group, which I mentioned in the last wrap up. Right, so he came earlier in the month. I interviewed him. It was a lot of fun. So thank you to everyone who attended. If you're watching this, Al was very friendly, very easy to get on with, as always. And it was fascinating to hear him share his thoughts on various different things. So I was particularly interested to learn about his new release, Halcyon Years, which is coming out pretty soon, later in October, I think. And also another book which he's only just finished under the working title of Merlin's Way. But we talked about a lot of other things besides. After the Q&A session, he joined a few of us at the pub afterwards, so that was fun. All in all, it was a very enjoyable evening. Anyway, let's get on to the books. So, I would say probably my highlight of the month in terms of books I've read would be City, right? So, by Clifford Simak. I read this as a buddy read with Chris from Liminal Spaces and Jim, aka John, from News from the Gelding, and I really enjoyed this one. It's a classic fix-up novel with a really interesting post-apocalyptic premise, with each chapter leaping forward in time to a new era. So I really liked that kind of structure, and I like the fact that this novel doesn't just focus on humanity and our future, but it also tells the story of the fate of all sorts of consciousness on Earth, including robots and dogs, but also other sorts of animals and post-human mutants. So we had a really enjoyable discussion after reading this book, and the video is available to watch on my channel if you're interested. So after that book, I moved on to We by Yevgeny Zamyatin, which is one of the great dystopian classics of the 20th century. So it was written in Russian in the early 1920s, but it wasn't published in the Soviet Union until quite a long time later. So it first came out in English translation, I believe, in the 20s. And this book was said to be a significant influence on Huxley and Orwell, but it's not as widely known as their works. But it's a very chilling narrative. It's set within this all-encompassing totalitarian state, and the story is told from journal entries from the point of view of a man living in this world. And I found the concepts and the world that Zamyatin constructed quite intriguing, but I did find it quite hard to relate to the protagonist or any of the other characters. The plot felt quite disjointed in some places and not as compelling as its more famous counterparts in Brave New World in 1984. But it's certainly a historical curiosity, and there are some very interesting ideas in there, so I'm glad I read it. Then I moved on to Second Foundation by Isaac Asimov, which is the final book in the Foundation trilogy. I had been putting off this book for quite a while, but I did want to finish the series, and I didn't want to leave it for over a year between books. So I finally got around to reading this book. I've posted a review just a few days ago, so I won't say a lot here. I'll just say it was a solid read, but a bit uneven. I really enjoyed the first part of the story, which was originally published as a novella, which opens the volume. But then it moves on to a longer novella, which forms the second part of the story and comprises the bulk of the book. And I didn't enjoy that one quite so much. So yeah, I've now finally completed the Foundation trilogy. I don't really feel compelled to read any of the other Foundation books, which Asimov wrote later on. I think I'm done with that series. But I would certainly be interested in reading more Asimov. So I think probably the next of his books that I will consider reading is I, Robot. After finishing that book, I moved on to The Green Millennium by Fritz Leiber. This one is from 1953, so it's another vintage SF novel, and it's my first time to read this author. I picked this book up based on Chris's recommendation. That's Chris from Liminal Spaces, from one of his videos. When he described the premise for this book, it sounded pretty wild. I haven't finished it yet. I'm about halfway through, but I'm really enjoying it. It's quite strange. It's a bit of a surreal sci-fi romp. It's set in a kind of strange dystopian world in which the protagonist discovers a mysterious green cat that shows up at his apartment one day. That's how the novel starts. And this cat has very strange properties. It seems to radiate a profound sense of joy and contentment. And that's how the book starts, and things just get a bit weirder from there. And it's quite an unpredictable novel. I don't really know where it's going, but I am enjoying it. So I might give this book a review soon. Let me know if you'd like to see that. So those are all of the sci-fi books that I've been reading in September. But that's not everything, actually. It would be remiss of me to mention the fact that I am also reading The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. This book is a little different because obviously it's fantasy. I've been reading this to my daughter, and we've both been really enjoying it. It's actually my first time to read The Hobbit. For some reason, it was never a part of my childhood. I read The Lord of the Rings when I was in my 20s, but that's about as far as I went with Tolkien. I have thought about reading the Hobbit since then. I enjoyed the movies, even though they are a bit bloated. But I was a bit ambivalent about reading The Hobbit because I always thought it was kind of a children's book. And at the back of my mind, I was always kind of thinking, well, I can read this book to my own children, if I ever have children. And so now that my daughter is old enough to appreciate it, this gave me an excuse to finally read it. And yeah, it's even better than I thought. It's a really charming tale. It's beautifully written. We both find it very entertaining. We're only about halfway through. My pace is quite slow because I only have the opportunity to read it aloud as a bedtime story. But anyway, I'm glad I'm finally reading it. So those are all the books that I've been reading during September. Let's move on to October. What's on the cards for this month? Now, before I go ahead, I'm going to mention that one usual aspect, one segment which I have been including in this part of the video of these wrap-ups up until now is the Spin the Wheel TBR Picker feature for choosing a TBR reading category, which has always been a bit of fun. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to stop doing that for the moment because the app that I use for this random picker has become subject to enshittification and now wants to charge me to carry on using it. And rather than paying for that privilege or switching to something else, I've decided I'm just going to stop using it for now. This will allow me a bit more flexibility when choosing what to read. What I might end up doing is putting aside a few books that I'm interested in reading that I really might want to read this month, an MBR if you like, and then making the actual decision later in the month. We'll see, but basically I'm going to sort these into two categories. They're the books which are the TBR I'm definitely going to read, and MBR, which are books which I might read later in the month. That gives me a bit of flexibility. Anyway, it's now October, spooky season, so that is a good excuse for me to read some horror, sci-fi horror. I've got a few classics and vintage stuff, again, that I really want to read, which fit into this category. I've got a couple of books that I'm definitely planning to read this month, and a couple more that I'm thinking about, but I'm not settled on yet. So we'll start off with the definites. Professor Dowell's Head. I'm definitely going to read this book. This will probably be my next read. This is a classic Russian mad scientist story, originally published as a short story in the 1920s before being expanded into a novel. I've read the short story version before. I really enjoyed it. It's a fascinating blend of sci-fi and horror and social allegory with Frankenstein-esque elements. And I picked up the novel earlier this year when I had an online book voucher to spend. So that's going on to the September TBR. And another book which I picked up with that same voucher is The Furies by Keith Roberts. I don't know a lot about this one, but this is one of those books which I heard about via BookTube on someone else's channel. And this one is from the 1960s. And I believe this is a novel about an invasion of giant mutated killer wasps. That's about as much as I know, but it sounds terrifying, right? I hate wasps. So I need to confront my fears, I think, and I think this would be a suitable sci-fi horror read for this month. Now, alongside these two horror novels, I have a couple of others that I'm thinking about that I may or may not read this month. One of those is The Rats by James Herbert, which is a classic 70s horror novel, which is kind of in the same vein as The Furies, i.e. it's a kind of creature feature, and it concerns an invasion of killer mutant rats in this case. This book's been on my radar for a while. I've heard it's quite shocking, it's quite gratuitous, perhaps pulpy even. So I think this would be a good choice. I might read the Rats. And there's another classic which I also have on my bookshelf, Who Goes There by John W. Campbell, which is a classic 1930s SF horror novella, which of course became the basis for The Thing, which is an amazing movie, right? The John Carpenter film. So I might save this one. I might read this one this month, or I might save it for November if I don't fit it into October, because in November I'm going to do Novella November, where basically I'm just focusing on novellas, and this is a novella. So yeah, I've got those two options. I'm not going to limit myself to those. If I see something else that I really want to read, then I'll read that as well. Of course, I need to finish The Green Millennium as well. Here it is. Look at that beautiful cover. Yeah, I'm really enjoying this. Anyway, those are the books that are on my radar at the minute. And that's all for today. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.